When Prince Edward summoned the palace archivist at midnight, no one expected the heir to utter words that would shake the monarchy's foundation. With Charles asleep and Anne away, Edward's voice cracked through years of royal silence, delivering a confession that would unravel the most guarded relationship in the Windsor family. This wasn't just a brother's admission, it was a cry for redemption and a secret the crown had buried deep. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The archivist, stunned by the late-night request, entered the heavily restricted wing of Windsor Castle with cautious steps, uncertain of what Edward needed, until he saw the expression on the prince's face. There was no royal posture, no ceremonial flair, only a man burdened by memory and betrayal. Edward asked for one file that hadn't seen the light of day in over 30 years. When it was brought to him, he didn't open it immediately. Instead, he stared at the sealed envelope, his fingers trembling, and said just 8 words that changed everything. "This is about what Anne did, and why I forgave her." His voice cracked not from age, but from carrying a truth too long locked away in silence. He began to speak not to the archivist, but to the walls, to the ghosts, to the weight of everything unsaid. He spoke of an event the royals had erased from memory, one so controversial that even whispering it within the palace could trigger internal crisis protocols. Charles, completely unaware of the unfolding storm, slept peacefully in another wing, oblivious that his brother was pulling at threads long forbidden to touch. Edward's confession wasn't loud, but it echoed. He referenced an incident, vague yet piercing, that had shifted the foundation of their family. The file, Edward claimed, was never supposed to resurface, but something in him snapped. And once it did, there was no going back. What truly shattered the atmosphere in that room wasn't just Edward's words, but the pain behind them. He spoke of Anne not as the rigid, unbreakable figure the world knew, but as someone who made a choice decades ago that left irreversible cracks in their bond. He didn't condemn her. Instead, he revealed a choice made under pressure, a secret action taken with noble intent but disastrous consequences. "They all hated her for it," Edward muttered, "but none of them knew the whole truth. Not even Charles." It was then that the archivist realized this wasn't just a late-night royal confession. It was an emotional explosion decades in the making. With every word, Edward dismantled the pristine illusion of royal perfection. His admission was laced with fear, relief, and something else, an urgent sense that time was running out. Whatever storm this confession would bring, Edward had already accepted it. He had made peace with betrayal. But the monarchy? It had no idea what was coming. And in that fragile moment, the future of the royal family became more uncertain than ever. But before Charles could react to what was coming, palace insiders were already scrambling, because Edward's confession wasn't just about Anne. It was about a lie that could unravel the very fabric of royal unity. Buried beneath decades of ceremony and silence lies one royal incident so shrouded in secrecy, not even biographers could touch it. Now, for the first time, Edward exposes the moment Anne crossed a line, forcing the palace into panic and the siblings into permanent Cold War. This wasn't royal drama, it was royal trauma. The summer of 1986 had all the markings of royal normalcy on the surface garden receptions, public tours and official engagements. But behind the stone walls of the palace, something erupted that would fracture the bond between two of the Queen's children. According to Edward's revelation, it all began with a letter. A single classified letter that was never intended for Anne's eyes. Yet somehow it reached her hands. And what she did next sent shockwaves through the inner sanctums of the royal institution. Edward claimed Anne not only read the contents but used them as leverage in a move that blindsided everyone, even the Queen herself. It wasn't betrayal in the traditional sense, it was a calculated act of control, driven by something deeper, something personal. Palace whispers from that era had referred to a situation known only among staff as the Gatcombe scandal. No one dared speak of it publicly, and even privately, only vague references were made. Staff were reshuffled. Security protocols around royal correspondence were tightened overnight. A line had been crossed, but no one outside the family circle knew by whom until now. Edward's confession shed light on the truth. Anne had intercepted a letter detailing a foreign intelligence arrangement involving a senior member of the family. Whether it was done out of concern, suspicion, or a need to assert dominance remains unclear. What is clear, however, is that her actions forced an internal reckoning. Edward, barely out of university at the time, was dragged into the maelstrom not by choice, but by circumstance. The Queen, caught between two fiercely loyal yet unyielding children, allegedly pulled Edward aside and said, "This must never reach your brother." That brother was Charles, the future king, the one person whose reaction to Anne's breach could have blown the monarchy wide open. And so a silent pact was born. Anne's actions would be buried, and Edward would carry the burden of secrecy. He became the silent witness, watching over the years as tensions between Charles and Anne simmered beneath the surface, disguised in protocol and politeness. But behind every royal wave and rehearsed smile, there was a fracture no one dared acknowledge. Edward lived with that fracture every day, torn between loyalty to his sister and a growing sense that the truth could no longer remain hidden. He buried his voice until now. The reasons for his sudden confession remain murky, but what is certain is that something has shifted, something powerful enough to make a man known for restraint choose to reopen a royal wound. And in doing so, he didn't just expose Anne, he set the stage for the monarchy's most personal reckoning yet. But why now? Why would Edward, after decades of loyalty, finally speak? The answer lies in a private meeting with Charles just hours later. When Edward uttered the final line of his confession, Charles reportedly turned white. "She wouldn't dare," he whispered, then stormed out of the room. For the first time in decades, the monarch's faith in his sister shattered, and with it came an avalanche of suppressed resentment. The silence that followed was deafening. Charles, who had mastered the art of emotional control throughout a lifetime under the public gaze, found himself unraveling behind closed doors. He paced the corridor of his private study like a man possessed, fists clenched, breath uneven, as Edward's words echoed relentlessly in his mind. It wasn't just the content of the confession. It was the timing, the delivery, and the implication that the one sibling he had trusted above all had been guarding a truth that threatened to undo the very mythology of their bond. For years, Anne had been the dependable one, the rock during their mother's reign, the one who never faltered, never betrayed. Now, every memory that once held warmth suddenly reeked of suspicion. Had every gesture of support, every look of loyalty, been nothing more than a shield for some thing darker? Charles lashed out not physically but verbally, turning his fury on Edward. "You've waited all these years to ruin her," he spat, a rare moment where the king was no longer monarch, but just a brother betrayed. Edward didn't answer. He didn't have to. The confession spoke for itself. Charles's mind whirled, not just with what had been said, but what it meant. The sibling who once stood guard over his most fragile moments, who defended him against internal critics, who even helped protect Camila from deeper scrutiny in the early days, was now cast in a new and disturbing light. Charles had built Anne into his image of strength, consistency, honor. To discover that image was built on a fault line shook him to his core. Emotionally raw, he began replaying decades of interactions. He remembered how Anne stood beside him during the darkest moments of his divorce, how she offered to take on extra duties when Camila faced public backlash, how she once said, "Whatever happens, I'll never let the family fall apart." But now those words sounded less like comfort and more like control. The monarch felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel: betrayal laced with humiliation. His internal struggle tore at him. Should he remain the king who preserves unity, or the man who demands accountability even from his own blood? Then came the moment that made the walls of the palace tremble, not with sound, but with symbolism. Alone in his study, Charles removed a framed portrait of Anne from his private office. It had been there for decades, a reminder of their bond, their shared legacy. He didn't smash it, he didn't curse, he simply placed it face down on the shelf as if bracing himself for a truth he could no longer ignore. The gesture wasn't one of rage, but of mourning, a silent acknowledgement that something sacred had fractured. But while Charles was trying to comprehend the past, Anne was about to make a move that would change the future. She arrived not through the front gates, but through the royal mews. No fanfare, no warning. Princess Anne walked into the storm with eyes that had seen decades of secrets and a folder marked for Charles only. If Edward had confessed, Anne had come to confront. Word had reached her within hours. The walls of the monarchy are thick but not impenetrable. Anne was told that Edward had broken rank, that he had spoken aloud the truth they had both buried long ago. And while others expected fury, denial, or panic, Anne responded with something far more chilling: composure. Without hesitation, she summoned her security detail, instructed a discreet return to the palace through the back, and told no one of her arrival, not even Charles. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had been here before, someone who had fought wars the world would never know, someone who wasn't here to explain herself but to end the noise. Because if Edward had cracked open the past, Anne was going to deliver it in full. She walked into the private study where Charles sat still reeling. Her face gave nothing away, but in her hands was the folder. Inside, letters, notes, handwritten messages, one unmistakably penned by their late mother. Anne placed the file on the desk without saying a word and simply stood. The silence was heavier than anger. Charles didn't rise, didn't speak, but his eyes searched her face, looking for some trace of remorse, some flicker of doubt. It never came. Instead, she spoke with the bluntness only Anne could command. "I protected this family in ways you'll never understand." And in that moment, the dynamic between brother and sister shifted, not as monarch and subordinate, but as two soldiers recalling different sides of the same battlefield. Charles, still unraveling from Edward's confession, demanded answers. Why the secrecy? Why the manipulation? Why the silence all these years? Anne listened, unmoved, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low but searing. "What I did," she said, "saved you, saved her, saved all of this." She gestured to the palace walls. "You think betrayal is silence?" No. Betrayal would have been letting the truth crush this family when it was already drowning. There was no apology, no admission of regret, but there was truth. And for the first time, Charles saw Anne not as the symbol of royal resolve, but as someone who had sacrificed herself to keep the rest standing. He looked through the letters, his hands shaking as he recognized the Queen's handwriting. The weight of what Anne carried for decades was beginning to dawn on him. And though no forgiveness passed between them, something shifted. Not reconciliation, but recognition. Anne didn't need Charles's blessing. She needed him to know. She needed him to carry it now, too. But one person wasn't buying Anne's defense and was about to dig even deeper. Queen Camila. While Charles reeled from emotional devastation, Camila quietly initiated her own probe. Behind the scenes, she activated a private investigator, one with ties to the late Queen's inner circle. Her mission? To uncover what really happened that summer, and whether Anne's silence had protected more than just the monarchy. Camila had seen enough in her years navigating the palace corridors to know when a story didn't add up. Anne's arrival, her iron resolve, and the carefully curated folder reeked not of confession but of control. Camila wasn't convinced. To her, this wasn't about shielding the family, it was about shielding something darker, something still hidden. The air in the palace had shifted. Charles was emotionally scattered, Edward was eerily quiet, and Anne was too composed. And Camila knew one thing with certainty: when everyone goes silent, the truth usually screams from the shadows. She remembered a private conversation she'd had with Queen Elizabeth just months before her passing. It had been brief, cryptic even. The Queen had spoken in fragments, warnings laced in politeness. "Anne carries more than you know," she had said, with that measured calm only a monarch could wield. At the time, Camila dismissed it. But now those words felt like a map. And so, without informing Charles, she reached out to someone whose name hadn't echoed in the palace in over 2 decades, a former investigator who had once helped manage the media frenzy during the Diana years. He was discreet, methodical, and had one talent that made him invaluable. He knew where the royals kept their real secrets. What followed was a trail of buried records, misfiled letters and recordings that had been stored under aliases and unrelated departments. One tape, in particular, sent a chill down Camilla's spine. It captured a conversation between Anne and a senior royal advisor. recorded shortly after the incident Edward had referenced. Anne's words were curt but revealing. She wasn't covering for herself. She was covering for someone else, someone who hadn't yet been named. The implication was devastating. Because if the true reason for the decades-long silence wasn't Anne's guilt, but the involvement of another royal figure, then the implications could shake the monarchy's bloodline itself. Camila, once merely suspicious, now felt cornered by the weight of what she had unearthed. Every instinct told her to go public, to reveal the findings and let the chips fall where they may. But she was warned quietly and firmly. A senior palace aide, loyal to the Queen's old guard, delivered a chilling message. If you pursue this, you risk unraveling more than a legacy. You risk collapse. The gravity of that statement left Camila in a spiral of indecision. But she didn't destroy the evidence. She kept it locked, close, waiting for the moment she could no longer stay silent. But just as Camila was ready to reveal her findings, Edward made a second confession, one that stunned even Anne. Everyone thought Edward had said everything. But what he revealed next redefined Anne not as a traitor but a protector. He spoke of a pact, a moment sealed in grief, guilt, and shared fear. Suddenly, the villain of the story began to look like its secret savior. Edward asked to speak again. This time, there was no archivist, no advisors, only family. His voice, already strained from confession, now trembled with something deeper regret. He told Charles that the truth he had shared was only the outer shell, that beneath Anne's actions lay something far more devastating. He spoke of their father, of a classified operation overseas that had gone catastrophically wrong, an operation so sensitive, so politically volatile, that exposure could have shattered Prince Philip's legacy and destabilized the monarchy at a moment when it could least survive scandal. Edward admitted that he had learned of it by accident. Anne had learned of it by design. According to Edward, Anne intercepted the letter not out of curiosity, but out of fear. Fear that the truth would reach the wrong hands, fear that their father would become the sacrifice. And in the days that followed, while Edward froze, Anne acted. She redirected blame, altered narratives, took responsibility for decisions that were never hers to own. She allowed whispers to circulate about her conduct, her temperament, her loyalty, knowing that every doubt cast on her pulled the spotlight further away from the Duke. She chose to be misunderstood, Edward said, his voice cracking, because being hated was easier than watching him fall. The emotional weight of those words collapsed the room into silence. Edward no longer sounded like a witness. He sounded like a man who had lived inside a debt he could never repay. He admitted that he and Anne made a pact in the aftermath of the crisis, a vow of silence forged not in loyalty to the institution, but in loyalty to their father. He confessed that Anne insisted on carrying the burden alone, while he stayed in the background, guarding the edges of the lie. "We buried the truth together," he whispered. "But only she paid the price." Then came the moment that broke him. Edward's composure shattered as he said the words he had clearly rehearsed but never truly faced. "She gave everything. A&D. We took everything from her." He spoke of years watching Anne endure strained relationships, isolation and suspicion from within her own family, never defending herself, never correcting the narrative. All because the alternative would have been catastrophic. He revealed the existence of a letter from the Queen Mother, written in the aftermath, acknowledging the sacrifice and approving the silence. A silent blessing, a royal burden passed down, sealed with ink and heartbreak. Edward turned to Charles then not as a younger brother, not as a prince, but as a man begging to be understood. "See Anne through our father's eyes," he pleaded, "not as what she appeared to be, but as what she chose to become, so the rest of us wouldn't have to." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. If true, then Anne had not betrayed the crown. She had bled for it. Now, with truths half buried and motives questioned, Charles is forced to make the most difficult decision of his reign. When you are king, your choices aren't your own. And yet, Charles found himself standing before two siblings, one who confessed and one who covered. The choice? Expose the truth and risk scandal, or protect the illusion and risk losing trust forever. The throne has never felt heavier. The palace was no longer a sanctuary but a storm. Charles, weighed down by a lifetime of protocol and buried emotion, stood at the edge of a decision no monarch desires. The private truths he had just heard, Edward's broken voice, Anne's unwavering defiance, the whispered shadow of Prince Philip's involvement had shattered the comfortable structure of royal loyalty. Now he wasn't just a brother. He was the symbol of an empire's continuity, and the decisions he made in this moment would ripple far beyond the crown. Advisors hovered like ghosts. Some urged him to go public, to reveal the layered truths with dignity and let the chips fall as they may. Others pleaded for silence, warning that exposure would not only crush Anne, but rattle the very legitimacy of their father's memory, and by extension, the institution itself. In one of the most emotional moments of his reign, Charles turned to his eldest son. Not as a king speaking to an heir, but as a father to his future. "You may face choices like this one day," he told William. "When truth and loyalty tear in different directions and no answer feels right." It was a raw admission, one not found in briefing and oaths or centuries of royal etiquette. William said little, but the weight in his eyes reflected a deep understanding his own crossroads would come, eventually. But for now, this burden was Charles's alone. As whispers seeped beyond the palace walls, the public began to take notice. The press, sharp and relentless, picked up on the subtle signs, tightened schedules, altered appearances and abrupt cancellations. Royal watchers speculated, columnists hinted at internal rifts, and former courtiers began appearing on television with cryptic remarks. "Something's happening behind those gates," one declared, "and it's bigger than anyone realizes." The media's interest ignited a firestorm, one that couldn't be controlled forever. Charles knew the illusion was fracturing, and action had to be taken. In a decisive but secretive move, the king arranged a private summit, a gathering of key royals behind sealed doors. It wasn't just to address the fallout, it was to confront everything they had buried. The palace ballroom wasn't filled with grand music or formal speeches this time, only a circle of strained faces, generational wounds, and the heavy air of reckoning. But before anything could be resolved, before apologies, decisions, or announcements, an unexpected voice returned to the center of the story. Because in her will, the late Queen Elizabeth left behind a sealed letter, never meant to be read until now. It had been locked away for years, her final message to her children. But as chaos engulfed the palace, Charles opened the letter marked in Her Majesty's handwriting. Its contents didn't just vindicate Anne, they changed everything the siblings thought they knew about their Ours legacy. The letter arrived in silence, retrieved from the Queen's private archive, under strict instruction. It was never meant for public eyes, never meant to shape policy or history. It was personal, tucked into an envelope marked with the Queen's initials and dated just 4 months before her passing. The letter had remained untouched until now. With his hands trembling and his heart split by revelation after revelation, Charles opened it not as a king, but as a son. And in those first few lines, everything shifted. The Queen had known. She had known about the incident. She had known about the pact. And more than that, she had blessed it. She wrote of Anne not as the stoic figure the public revered, but as my fiercest protector. The words leapt from the page not out of sentimentality, but recognition. She took the burden no one else would, the Queen wrote, not out of pride, but because she feared what it would do to you. The words cut deep. Charles had spent weeks torn between love and duty, justice and loyalty. But here, in his mother's own handwriting, was the confirmation he never expected. Anne hadn't betrayed the family, she had preserved it, quietly, painfully, completely. And then came the line that made him stop breathing for a moment. "I watched you retreat from the family, Charles, from its pain, from its flaws. I hoped one day you would return to it, not just as king, but as brother. It wasn't a reprimand, it was a plea, a subtle but piercing expression of disappointment." The Queen had always been a monarch first, but in this letter she was a mother, one who had seen her children fracture beneath the weight of duty and silence. The final line was, quietest, and yet the loudest. Edward was always the one who listened, listen now. And Charles did. He read the line again and again and again. The tears came without warning. Alone at his desk, the king wept not out of shame but out of release. The burdens, the questions, the legacy, they all unraveled in that moment. The letter didn't resolve everything, but it lit the path forward. For the first time in years, Charles saw his siblings not as adversaries, but as people who had suffered just as he had, in silence for the sake of something greater. The monarchy didn't shift in that moment because of power. It shifted because of understanding. The process of reconciliation had begun not because of a royal edict, but because of a mother's final truth. But before healing could begin, the press got wind of the drama, triggering a headline that would ignite global frenzy. News leaked. Headlines screamed betrayal. Cameras zoomed in on the gates of Buckingham Palace as reporters speculated whether Anne would be stripped of her duties or honoured as the quiet protector of the crown. The family was on the brink of either reunion or ruin. The story spread like wildfire. What had begun as a contained royal reckoning now exploded into the global spotlight. Morning shows, late-night anchors, podcasts, columnists, everyone had a take. Was Anne the architect of deception or the guardian of royal dignity? Had Charles lost control of his own family? Was Edward the accidental hero or a calculated orchestrator? The speculation was endless, and the palace's silence only fanned the flames. Rumours spiraled about emergency meetings, impending announcements, and even a potential resignation of senior royals. For the public, it was chaos. But inside the palace, a decision had been made. Without warning, Buckingham Palace issued an official statement, brief, deliberate, and cryptic. It announced a surprise appearance from the king alongside Princess Anne and Prince Edward. No further context, no elaboration. The media braced for impact. And when the gates finally opened, what unfolded was nothing short of seismic. Charles emerged first, solemn and composed. Edward followed, his posture steadier than ever. But it was Anne's arrival that froze time. She walked beside them, neither hiding nor defiant, silent but proud. The crowd gasped. The image alone told a story words could never fully capture. Not exile, not disgrace, but unity born from pain. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed, but it was Charles's voice that cut through the noise. What binds this family is stronger than what tested it, he said. A simple sentence, but in that moment it felt like a proclamation, a line in the sand, redemption in royal form, delivered without confession, only presence. The palace didn't confirm the contents of the letter. It didn't explain the years of silence or the buried truths, but it didn't need to. The symbolism said it all. Edward's public image transformed overnight. No longer the passive, soft-spoken younger brother, he was now seen as the moral compass of the monarchy. The one who broke protocol not to destroy, but to heal. The truth-bearer, the media called him. Headlines once filled with suspicion toward Anne were now replaced with words like sacrifice, duty, and protector. Yet even in the tide of shifting narratives, one detail remained untouched: the folder Anne had carried into that fateful meeting. The one marked for Charles only. It was never opened in public, its contents never disclosed, and that silence left a single haunting question hanging in the air. Because in the monarchy, every secret has a shadow, and every revelation leaves one final question: what else remains hidden? Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.